I'm going to start with this conception of eudaimonia as a form of success that has to do with a purposeful well-being, right? So living a values-driven life, knowing what it is that you want and being able to strive for that and move for that. We all know who this is, legendary John Wooden, and his definition of success is peace of mind in knowing you did your best. And when I first read Wooden and I saw this, it was very comforting because I thought, this is great. Success is now in my control. All I have to do is do my best, and whatever else happens around me, not a big deal, right? It kind of simplifies things. I just have to work hard and do my best. But as I tried to make that a part of my life, I realized there's a puzzle here. And the puzzle is that knowing you do your best really means knowing what is your best. What is that limit, right? So if you get an A on every test, is that your best? Right? Do you really know if you're doing your best? If you win every race that you run, are you really testing your limit? Right? So in some ways, we need to ask ourselves, how do we find that limit? How do we know if we're actually doing our best? So think about that for a minute. But I want to point out that I think failure is important as part of success. So I want folks to leave here today feeling like failure is not something to fear. It's something to move towards. If we don't fail, we don't know what could have been. Right? We don't know what our best could have been. The Bjorks have done decades of work on something called desirable difficulties. So desirable difficulties, my misrepresentation of that is that it is specific challenges that make us learn better. So this is in the area of learning and memory. And what they've shown is that if you introduce specific challenges in learning and actually make learning feel harder and more complicated, people remember things longer. So the way we learn, the way we approach academics, courses, and so forth, is actually better if we force people to struggle a little bit. And even things like giving people a quiz and having them get questions wrong, that's better than having them get all the questions right in terms of long-term memory. What's interesting about this work, to me, and what makes it a metaphor for many aspects of life, is that if you judge how you're doing by your current performance, you may feel like you're failing. But in the context of desirable difficulties, you might say, this struggle, this momentary failure is preparing me to be better in the long run. And so the Bjorks point out, don't confuse your immediate performance with whether you're learning or changing over time. And in fact, struggle now may be an indicator that you're going to be performing better over time, right? So it may be a positive thing. So we can change our brains, we can change our bodies for the better by facing failure, by taking on challenge, and by struggling. Don't leave here thinking success is one way, failure is another. If you see failure coming, you're probably going in the right direction. Wooden has even said himself, if you're not making mistakes, you're not doing anything, right? So he has also said we need to be taking chances, taking risks. Now, you might be thinking, okay, so this recipe for eudaimonia, he's just telling us to go out and fail or just struggle, right? So there's more to it than struggle. Effort is extremely important. If we fail without effort, it's just failure, right? I could just go out and do all kinds of things I'm not prepared to do and fail, and that's not what we're talking about, right? So effort is very important. And in fact, I'm going to talk about another body of literature in psychology called based on Carol Dweck's work called the growth mindset. And what Dweck has shown is that children who encounter difficulty in school differ on how they interpret those difficulties. So some people attribute those things to their own attributes. This is called a fixed mindset. So they might say, I'm really smart, I got a good grade on a test. I'm not so smart because I didn't get a good grade on this test, or I'm not smart enough. But there are these other children who have a growth mindset, who say, I didn't do well because I didn't try hard enough. And she uses the phrase, not yet kind of thinking. And those kids, when they don't do well, they said, I didn't do this yet, but with effort, I can do it in the future. If I challenge myself, this is an opportunity to get better. What she's found is that those kids do better over time academically. This may be more important than how smart you are, is how you would attribute your success or failure, whether you attribute that to effort or not. And the really nice thing about Dweck's work is that she's shown you don't have to be a fixed mindset person. You can choose how you interpret challenging experiences. And if you attribute them to effort, you're going to look at every tough moment in your life as an opportunity to get stronger, to get better, to move towards those goals. Here's a kid who's read all of Dweck's work, and he's choosing the big wheelbarrow. I'm going to give an example from my life. In my work, we do work with children's mental health, and I'm going to tell you a story of how my laboratory, we stared failure in the face, and we went through this kind of thinking about, what are we going to do? So we try to help children have better lives. How do we do that? We develop treatment programs, we implement those in communities, and we do studies to see if they work. So we set out to do a study. Now, I don't have any colorful pictures of brains, but I do have bar graphs, and that's like the next best science, I think. It's one step down. So here's a bar. Look at that. It just doesn't have to have any numbers or anything. It's already science right there. So the test program, what we were testing, in a typical study, you want to test it against a control group, right? And you want your test program to be better than a control group. So our test program, right? So that's what a real scientific histogram looks like when something's better. So our program was called MATCH. It was about helping children with anxiety, depression, traumatic stress, and conduct problems. And there's a variety of ways to test things, right? You can test against a control group that has a waitlist condition, right? That just simply means you're showing your treatment's better than nothing. Well, that's not very challenging, right? We're kind of growth mindset, desirable difficulty kinds of people. We want a bigger challenge than that. So you can test your program against a placebo, and that means it did well. If it wins, it means it did well, not because people believe in it, but because it has a specific ingredient that actually works, right? But we're tougher than that, right? Our team, we were like, well, we can do better. Let's go out and see if we can beat what's already happening in the community. Let's take the services that are going on in the community and see if we can do better. You see these bars are getting closer, so this is a tough challenge. This is a tough test. And this was all fine. Now, we went to launch this study in 2008, 2009, when the housing market crashed. And long story short, this allowed the state of California to tap into an emergency fund because mental health services funding was threatened. They tapped into this emergency fund, and the sort of ironic thing that happened was they were able to spend this money if they invested in new, shiny, brand new, gold standard, best things you can find in the world. So what happened to our control group, it became this monster, 50 of the best treatments in the country. As I mentioned, this was based on a state law, so this was actually signed off by our then governor, Arnold Schwarzenegger. So we were now finding ourselves in a position where this was our study, right? This is where we were headed. And now I'm going to tell you another technical scientific term. When you're in this situation, your control group is actually referred to as an out-of-control group, right? So I've set this up to look like we're going to get steamrolled. We didn't know. Of course, you can talk to my students. We said, we still think we can do it. And we also think, apropos to what I said earlier, if we don't, we're all going to learn something. Everybody. We're going to learn something about helping children, right? So this is the right thing to do. We're not going to quit. We're not going to back down. And the good news is, we were kind of wrong. We did about twice as well as that collection of gold standard programs. This was a 5-year study. It took us 5 years to get to this answer. So 5 years I wasn't sleeping at night to wait for this bar graph, right? That's how slow science is. So for years, our field thought that more is better. And we learned from this study, better is better. And it sounds simple, but it's not what we thought. So this was a surprise to all of us. But it wouldn't be fair if I just said, oh, I just pulled a story of success in a talk about failure, right? What we did after this is we said, what could we have done better? Because we didn't find our limit, right? We need to look for the tough thing, where are we failing now? So we have spent the last several years looking at how this program was failing, even when in the context of success. 2 things I can tell you is that I'll confess our failures, I'm not hiding them. Many families dropped out of that treatment, even though it was successful. We've spent the last few years working on how to fix that problem. And many crises came up during treatments that we were completely unprepared to solve. It led to worse outcomes for families. We think we can do better if we go after that. So another corollary here is even when in the context of success, it's good to focus on where could I have done even a bit better. So I'm going to end by saying Don't be determined to fail, but be willing to fail. Don't be afraid. If we had been afraid, we never would have learned what we did in that study. And be determined to learn your own limits, and be determined to learn when you do fail, learn why, and maybe it will make you stronger in that desirable difficulties kind of way. So I want to leave people thinking, there's probably something you came into this room thinking you can't do. And I want you to think today, what impossible thing that you thought was out of reach that you might try to do this year. And I hope I've convinced you that if you approach it right and you think about it right, no matter what the outcome, you're going to be successful.